With the conflict in Ukraine entering its 5th year, who really holds the key to ending the war? U.S. President Trump insisted he could solve the conflict on day one. But some EU leaders say it's China who quietly holds the cards. So is continuing the war in Beijing's interest? And are U.S. threats against China actually hurting Ukraine? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Well, back in October, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said clearly that China does not want Ukraine to win the war with Russia. It wasn't just her opinion. She actually said her Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, explained that if the war stopped, Washington's attention would turn to Beijing instead. So while the war might not be popular with the Chinese people, it's actually in Beijing's interest to allow it to continue. Meanwhile, Ukraine has said China is effectively assisting Russia to that end by supplying technology and an economic lifeline to Moscow. And that seriously curtails the leverage and influence of the U.S. and the EU. Here's a look.
Ukraine's president addressing the nation on a somber anniversary.
Today marks exactly 4 years since Putin started his 3-day push to take Kiev. And that, in fact, says a great deal about our resistance, about how Ukraine has fought all this time.
Silence in the streets, a simple but profound moment, honouring the dead and marking the war that dragged on far longer than Russians, NATO allies, and Ukrainians expected. After 4 years, Russia now occupies and controls swathes of the country's east, but has failed to capture Kiev, topple Zelenskyy, or overrun Ukraine as a whole. Western allies have provided material support, funding and aid to Ukraine, and applied sweeping sanctions against Russia. But gradually, a bigger light is being shone on the indirect help China is giving Moscow.
This war is being completely enabled by China. And China could call Vladimir Putin and end this war tomorrow and cut off his dual-purpose technologies that they're selling. China could stop buying Russian oil and gas. There are lots of opportunities for the world to put pressure on China.
China is officially neutral on the Russian war on paper, but the quiet assistance and tacit support Beijing gives Moscow are an open secret. Chinese-made components flood the skies inside drones that Russia uses in attacks on the battlefronts. An exclusive Reuters report in September last year revealed that Chinese drone scientists and engineers had worked directly with a sanctioned Russian arms manufacturer. Ukraine has also accused China of supplying artillery shells and gunpowder to Russia. China rejects those accusations. Beijing has hosted President Putin at least 5 times since Russia's full-scale invasion, most recently in February.
This year also marks the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the China-Russia Strategic Partnership of Coordination, the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation between China and Russia, and the launch of the China-Russia Years of Education.
All the more galling for Kiev is that in 2013, China was seen as a Ukrainian ally, even signing a treaty of friendship that remains in place. Before that, China lauded Ukraine for giving up its nuclear weapons after the breakup of the USSR, signing security agreements if Ukraine was ever attacked. A treaty that may not be worth the paper it's written on. China has massively increased its imports of Russian energy and supported Russia in the United Nations Security Council on multiple occasions. Should China be held more responsible for its actions and inactions when it comes to influencing its neighbour to its north to end the war sooner? After 4 years, it's a question many in NATO, the EU, and indeed many Ukrainians find themselves increasingly asking.
So is China the real yet unspoken power broker in the Ukraine war equation? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are, from New London, Connecticut, the CEO of CJPA Global Advisors, Earl Carr. From London, Senior Visiting Research Fellow at King's College London, Anna Matvieva. And from New York, Communications Director for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, Andrei Drobryansky. Thank you all so much for being with me. Earl, I'll start with you because just today, China said all parties need to grasp opportunities for peace in this conflict. So is China being duplicitous here?
That's a great question, Andrea, and it's great to see you again. I think the Chinese notion of engaging parties has been a long-standing policy. The question is how do they have a real incentive to see this war end? And I think the longer that it takes pressure off the Chinese is good for Chinese foreign policy, is good for their national objectives. I think what was interesting at the Munich Security Conference was how relieved the Chinese were that there wasn't so much pressure on them. So I think that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors here. There's a lot of talk about we want collaboration, we want dialogue, but the reality is, what is China willing to really put on the table? Are they really willing to cut off oil to Russia? And the answer is no.
But you've also said that a negotiated outcome that means a surviving sovereign Ukraine would likely strengthen the Western-led order that China effectively wants to erode.
Yes. And I think that in many ways, the Chinese share a border with Russia. There is enhanced collaboration on a variety of different levels. I mean, China does not have an incentive to see Russia decline in many different ways. However, what we've actually seen the exact opposite. We've seen Russia a lot more subservient to China in so many different ways. So I think that's an important equation to factor into the dynamic and evolving relationship.
Right. Andre, I could see you agree there, but let me turn to Anna quickly because there is a highly strategic relationship at play that you've spoken about between Russia and China. Some would argue at Ukraine's expense, but explain why it actually works. What does Russia get and what does China get?
Well, there are two things here. First, if we look at countries which actually benefited from the Russian-Ukrainian war, and they are obvious losers: Russia, Ukraine, Europe. But China has benefited from the war, and so did the United States, which managed to get a bigger share of the energy market from Russia. So from China, I'm not sure whether China is really driven by the interest of global domination, but I think that China is much more driven by the national interests. And the war in Ukraine does serve Chinese interests pretty well. They now have cheap energy from Russia and are coming more of it because some of the shares which India used to buy of Russian oil now is going to China. Russia exports coal, other products. It buys Chinese manufactured goods, components. There is technological cooperation. Russia is also a polygon for Chinese manufactured, not weapons, but various components and technologies. Beijing just unveiled the parade on Tiananmen Square of robotic soldiers. Would we be seeing them in future somewhere in the battlefield in Ukraine to test them in action? So there is a whole of a lot of issues where also Russia opened its market to the Chinese goods.
Okay.
Now most cars are from China in the Russian market. So yes, the economic incentives and also kind of geopolitical incentives do work in favor of continuation of war in some shape or form.
Okay. Let me get Andrei's take. I've seen a few smirks, if I can put it that way. Go ahead. What's your analysis of the opinions you just heard?
No, I'm in agreement with our fellow speakers, understanding, of course, that Russia is fully beholden to China at this moment. This has been called out again and again at the Security Council. at the Munich Security Council conference, even people recognizing that without China's support, Russia would be nowhere. Their entire economy has been turned over into a military status. They're really not generating anything other than raw natural resources that could be used for export. Nobody other than certain second-tier countries would be buying their weaponry. So the last thing is the fact that not only is China supplying 80% of the chips and the materials that are needed for the weapons of war that are being used against Ukraine, but at this point, Russia has so tapped out its native economy that it is selling its gold reserve to China in the last several months. This is the only way that Russia survives at the moment. And so I think people need to stress the absolutely beholdenness of Russia to China at this moment, which has been called out again, like I said, at the Security Council several times, but it's really not being taken into account. Maybe the one smirk I had, Andrea, was the fact that, yes, they are neighboring countries, and yes, there are territories that could be fought over between the two, and yet for some reason, China has not taken advantage of the weakened Russian military to reclaim some of its territory.
Yeah, I mean, it is somewhat cynical geopolitical strategy, some might say, but if it's working in China's interest, that's what China will do. So on the flip side, Earl, let me ask you, if you think the United States has maybe failed to recognize the strength of the role that China plays here, and that its threats against China, particularly against its economy, have kind of quietly backfired in unexpected ways.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the Trump administration, through Envoy Witkoff, has made very clear that China could end this war if it chose to choke off oil exports to Russia, and has chosen not to. China has made a lot of overtures with respect to economic aid to Ukraine. However, it has failed to disclose what exactly is involved or the amount of aid to Ukraine. So I think the United States has been very clear-eyed on the role and the economic lifeline, as both Anna and Andrea has mentioned, to Russia. The other interesting thing that I think is important is that as China as Russia becomes increasingly more subservient to Russia, I think it's important that the role that how can China what's the end game here? And I think that the end game is really to have pressure off of China, to have the pressure more on NATO, to see a weakened NATO, and I think ultimately that benefits China's strategic interests.
Okay, let me ask Anna then, would Russia really have survived all the sanctions and all the geopolitical isolation without this level of Chinese support? And is China now risking, now that it's more out in the open, let's put it that way, is China now risking further U.S. ire and punitive sanctions for this more obvious position it has on Ukraine?
Well, let's start with the reverse. I would say that Chinese diplomatic stance has not been contradicting the international law or UN Charter. The Chinese leadership always said that we recognize Ukrainian territorial integrity. If we remember, 3 years ago, there was a Chinese peace proposal on the table. It has been sort of smeared, somehow looked down by the Western leaders at the time. So you cannot reproach China, at least in its public diplomacy, not trying to make some kind of inroads towards peace. Whether Russian economy would have been worse off without Chinese ties with China, definitely whether it would have been that bad that it would have led to a complete strategic defeat for the leadership to change its objectives, that's another matter. And I personally do not think so. But yes, it would have been made the battlefield progress harder. We have to bear in mind that both sides, Russia and Ukraine, do have external backers. They all make this war possible. They all prolong this war. So yeah, the West helps Ukraine. There are other countries which help to some extent Russia. So the war is a very much kind of externally backed. We can say that okay, if those backers cut off their assistance, things would have changed entirely, and I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Andre, this question really is for you and Earl both. I'll start with you because when I say U.S. threats against China, it's not just Trump's tariff threats. It's also, the past administration saying the U.S. will defend Taiwan against a Chinese invasion. So can you blame China for kind of throwing Ukraine under the proverbial bus if the U.S. behaves this way toward Beijing?
Well, I don't really see China doing anything much different than it has been for decades. It's taking advantage where it can to extend its influence abroad. The United States administrations, from Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump again, have been very wary of China's influence in other countries, specifically in Europe, specifically in Ukraine, blocking a deal that could have been made back in Obama's era about a former military installation turned factory that China wanted to acquire. And now we're seeing what's happening with Canada also. I believe as a whole, the United States is failing in its efforts under this administration to restrict China. I do want to point out that when the argument is made that outside forces are extending this war, it should be noted that those who are helping Ukraine aren't extending the war. They're trying to make sure that all Ukrainians aren't killed and sent to murder camps. So there's a difference with those countries who are aiding Russia to attack a sovereign country on a sovereign country's territory, and those that are trying to make sure that a sovereign territory is both protecting its citizens and repelling an invasion. But yes, China has been actively trying to put its hands within Ukraine, within other countries as well, extending its diplomatic influence. But as far as your proposition of testing the United States' solid commitment to Taiwan, I would actually much more look at the northern border of China and Russia, and with a completely weakened Russia that has lost over 20,000 of these mechanized vehicles that we see in front of us on the screen, Manchuria is very, very much a testing ground for any future invasion of China. China, a country that has not had a major land war to test its forces, I would think that they would do something on its immediate border, then traverse an entire maritime body to attack Taiwan.
Okay. Let me let Earl go first because, Anna, I can see you disagree as well. But go ahead, Earl.
No, it's a great question, Andrea, and I think where we have seen a complete backfiring in the Chinese pressure is with respect to Japan and Japan's prime minister. You may recall that Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi made a comment that Japan would essentially defend Taiwan, and there was enormous economic pressure put on Japan. And what we saw was that in many ways it backfired. The prime minister has now, with a new snap election, has come out significantly stronger with a mandate to not only repel Chinese economic coercion, but also with a stronger mandate to actually support Taiwan. So I think the U.S. Was very happy about that. I think the United States, with respect to Taiwan, has always mandated that they will, according to the 1979 Taiwan, there's an act that we are required to sell weapons to Taiwan. So I think that it's important that we understand that dynamic with Taiwan, with the overall geopolitical situation.
Okay. Well, let me ask Anna what you were disagreeing with earlier.
I think that the idea that China attacks Russia or Russia attacks China over the mutual border is totally ludicrous. I can't imagine anything more fantastic than that. To remind you viewers that because it was so important for Moscow to improve relations in Beijing in early 90s, they ceded the disputed territory. It's not a large piece of territory, but they have been fighting over Damansky Island in the Soviet times. So in order to improve relations, Russia has handed over some of the disputed territory to China. But the value of strategic partnership, the alliance for both countries, is enormous in military terms, in economic terms we mentioned, but also in all the geopolitical aspects. Because of the war, now yuan is challenging dollar in some of the jurisdictions. We are seeing more yuan presence. We also see China and Russia building institutions, strengthening them, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like BRICS. They do draw new membership. So these are ambitions which bind the countries together, and certainly they are not going to be very easily sacrificed.
Okay. Andre, let me ask you this. Since we addressed some of the more contemporary history, do you think another part of that contemporary history has been forgotten? Because China had signed treaties with Ukraine promising positive security assurances. It was like less than 15 years ago. So why was it agreed at that time and not now, especially with Russia actually threatening the use of its own nuclear arsenal in this war, which is exactly what China had guaranteed Ukraine a prevention of?
Well, I really treat the countries of the fringe nations, if you want to refer to China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, those countries that are operating outside the international agreements of other countries, those that don't find a problem with violating international airspace or sovereign territory of other countries. And it's very clear that you mentioned an agreement that China made with Ukraine. Russia just signed an agreement with Iran a couple of months ago, and clearly is not going to come to Iran's aid, nor did it come to Iran's aid during Operation Midnight Hammer. So there are certain countries that it seems that their obligations are more transactional. We will see if the Western Alliance maintains their steadfast support of each other as they have for decades, and yet it's being called into question now with this new U.S. administration. But the kind of agreements that are made with other countries, this is why, as ludicrous as it may sound, this is why I do not contend that the partnership of different countries like Russia and China are something that are locked in stone, and rather more transactional. And the fact is that Russia cannot maintain another war with another country. So my proposition is simply that Russia is too weak to do anything if China were to announce a claim of territory.
Andre, quickly though, give me a reason for China to come to Ukraine's defense and not work with Russia in this strategic partnership at the cost of Ukraine's security, other than just, to do the right thing. Give me a reason why China should actually defend Ukraine.
Well, having just come back from Ukraine and the neighboring territories in Europe, I can tell you that one of the major economic booms that everybody is looking forward to is a major reconstruction of Ukraine. And China really wants to have its hands in there. And the one thing that would block China from being invited into investing into Ukraine, being a part of the rebirth of that nation, would be this continued support. And the one way it could come into the good graces of the West is to summarily cut off its support of Russia. Russia has done everything that it possibly could by itself. It has lost an enormous amount of material, equipment, men. It is at its last legs. If China were to cut its losses now, it would have the good graces of Ukraine to be allowed to invest in Ukraine and be part of the hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that are happening in that country should a peace agreement be found.
Should a peace agreement be found? I mean, Earl, that's the big question. Go ahead.
I would also argue that it gives China cover for those countries, particularly in the global south, that want to trade with China. It gives them cover to be able to do that and not draw them into this potential war or ire of the United States that could produce secondary sanctions on China or these other countries that want to trade with China, particularly as China has enhanced the globalization of the renminbi. We saw that particularly with Russia. Vast majority of Russian trade in oil is now all in renminbi. So I think this is an important factor that needs to be considered.
So, Anna, I mean, having said that, this is all contingent on if this war ends, you know, what the future consequences for China could be. But, I mean, how much longer can this war continue? Can Russia continue this war indefinitely? It's now starting its 5th year.
Well, I find the argument that Russia is on its last legs to be very emotional. The facts do not confirm this argument. Yes, Russia does have certain problems. Ukraine also have problems. The West has problems. But that they are not anywhere near to change the strategic calculus of the leadership and also of society. In terms of China, that's also important that China understands that Western nations do not like its stance on Ukraine. They also know that they can do virtually nothing to China because it is stronger vis-a-vis, especially European nations. All of them, they are now. Friedrich Merz is going to China. Macron has been. Keir Starmer has traveled there. They all want cooperation with China. They're in no way to dictate any terms to China whatsoever.
Anna, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us in a very insightful discussion, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.